So often, international schools make it a part of their mission to educate global citizens who are in service to their community. But to what extent are the students really engaged in becoming better global citizens? So, yes, this is a worthy goal, and like many big goals, it needs action steps with lots of planning, implementation support, and accountability to determine if the school is on track. The usual questions come into play regarding who, what, why, etc., with the how being the most prominent in our interview with LeeAnne Lavender, who helps schools with their service learning and global citizenship development efforts. What I really appreciated from our conversation is how LeeAnne works with teachers to integrate service learning and global citizenship into their regular classroom curriculum. I also appreciated the pedagogy that LeeAnne uses, drawing on many tried and true instructional strategies that we know work in our classrooms. Our guiding questions for the show were: what is service learning? What is global citizenship? What are some ways to integrate both into the culture of a school? Here are a few of the topics covered in this episode. Digital storytelling as a powerful tool for student agency and creativity, using the design cycle for integration purposes, leveraging differentiation and using universal design for learning, UDL, service learning as experiential learning, supporting life skill development, deep listening to connect with stakeholders, the intersectionality of service learning, global citizenship, and potentially other initiatives. LeeAnne Lavender is an educational consultant, coach, and facilitator for international educators. She specializes in storytelling, digital storytelling, service learning, and global citizenship. LeeAnne loves partnering with schools and teachers to create learning experiences that have impact and lead to deep learning and service as action. Look to learn more about LeeAnne and her Going Global experiences in our show notes, which include a link to her very informative website. This show was recorded on January 13th, 2025. Prepare to learn how LeeAnne engages her creativity and coaching skills to help educators see global citizenship and service learning not as add-ons, but as integral components of their curriculum and the culture of their schools. LeeAnne's stories of working with teachers again demonstrates the how to take action to integrate service learning and global citizenship into one's lessons.
Hi, LeeAnne, and welcome to Educators Going Global. It's good to have you here. We start off by asking you where in the world you are.
That is a great question. And at this moment in time, I am sitting in my home office in Trenton, Ontario, Canada, which is where I am when I'm not at schools or at conferences in other parts of the world. So, yeah, I'm here in this cozy little office right now.
Nice. And that's a part of the world that I've also been familiar with back in school. So it's awesome to touch base with somebody that is in that area. I have a lot of friends in the area. If you wouldn't mind, we'd appreciate if you would share a going global story. What have you got?
Yes, I love your prompt for the Going Global story. And one thing that immediately came to mind for me was a story about the first weekend that my husband and two of our three daughters spent outside of Nairobi when we first moved to work at the International School of Kenya. And this is back in 2010. And we had moved there and, of course, spent the first number of weeks getting settled in, etc. And then about maybe 5 or 6 weeks into our stay in Nairobi, which was a wonderful 5 years that we had there, we had the opportunity to go out of town for the weekend, and we went down to Lake Naivasha, and we stayed at this amazing little place where you could actually do these walking safaris. So we were staying in this beautiful cabin, and everything was very beautiful and lush. The nature was amazing. You're looking down at this crater lake, and it was in the evening. And one of the things we were able to do was actually to go on a walk and kind of come up to a ridge where you could see the vista from this ridge. And as we were walking up through this kind of scrubby forest, it wasn't savanna, it wasn't forest, it was somewhere in between, we realized that probably about maybe 10 feet to the right of us were two amazing giraffes. And they were kind of walking along with us up this hill. And having never seen a giraffe in the wild before, it was one of those life moments for me where I was like, I am never going to forget this moment. I am never going to forget how I feel. My daughters were absolutely, of course, just gobsmacked at the whole experience. And it just really drove home to me the magic of being in new places and the wonder that can come when, we open ourselves to new places and find ourselves in these situations. And of course, we went on to have many, many wonderful experiences with animals in Kenya over the time that we were there. But that particular night and the magic of that night is something that will just stick with me forever.
I love that word wonder. And this isn't so much moving out of your comfort zone. I guess it is. Not every day you take a walk with giraffes. Yet, just opening ourselves up to new experiences inside schools, outside schools, that's such a theme of our interview. So thank you for sharing that. And now I'm going to come right out and say to folks, go to LeeAnne's website, and we'll share it in just a little bit. It really communicates what she is all about regarding international education in her areas of expertise. So let's jump into the guiding question. So we're going to have this big, broad question, but then we're going to break it down into parts. So first of all, what is service learning? What is global citizenship? And what are some ways to integrate both into the culture of a school? And that's a key word, integrate. And I really appreciate that about your approach. So let's start with service learning. What forms can it take, and how can it impact student learning?
I love these questions so much because this is just such a passion area for me. So thank you for that question and that series of questions. Service learning is an approach to teaching and learning that really is applied learning. It's asking students to take knowledge and skills from a specific unit of study and apply those to local and global contexts in ways that create positive and purposeful change. And so I love service learning because it is a way of teaching that is super transformative, both for the learner, I think for the teacher as well, because of what we witness and how we're involved in the process, and for our local and global communities. And so there are so many layers to what that looks like. And it really impacts everything from the investigation and the inquiry and research that happen, let's say at the beginning and throughout the unit, all the way through to the way that students then are assessed in terms of the standards of that unit and what they've learned and how they can actually use what they've learned in real contexts. And so it's a beautiful, transformative way of helping students be fully engaged, to see the relevance of what they're learning, and then also to be equipped and empowered as change seekers and change makers, so that we can really think about, most schools, most international schools in their mission and vision have something in there, right, about our students being global citizens, being people who make a positive difference or contribution to the world. And there are some schools that have that how really figured out. And the how is usually service learning or active global citizenship or community engagement. And often these terms are used very interchangeably. And so I love that, this type of teaching and learning can result in all of these impacts for the learner and for our communities, but also for our schools, really feeling like this is what we say we do. Yeah, we're actually doing it. So in a nutshell, that's what service learning is. And in a way, it's also very much what active global citizenship is, with some little tweaks that might be slightly different.
Well, I really appreciate the how. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and we're in Bangkok with some super competitive international schools. And my friend's not an educator. And what she said right off the bat was, are they really doing that service learning? Are they really doing that global learning? Or is it a nice little video on their website? So I really appreciate that processing of how to make this a part of the student learning. And I hear some key words there: experiential. I'm a outward bound guy from a long time ago, and that is so powerful. We know where the students are out, and especially in the world today where they need to be experiencing life and not a screen in front of their face. And I'm hearing about inquiry as a part of the approach, which is such a normal part of curriculum and teaching and learning. And clearly it's student centered, that they're going to have these experiences, they're going to have their questions. I know, as you just said, we're going to have layers to this, but I'm really appreciating how you're setting this up to make it really happen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I have so many examples of what this looks like, all the way from pre-kindergarten to grade 12. And so as we have our conversation, I'm sure some of those examples will tumble out.
Well, actually, I'll piggyback on that a little bit because as you were talking about it, I thought, LeeAnne is a storyteller. Maybe you could tell us a little story about an impactful service learning opportunity that you were involved with.
Yes, I would be delighted to do so. Let me start with one that's quite recent because I had a wonderful experience coaching a teacher, a grade 7 teacher who teaches ELL actually at IS Kenya, ISK. It's so wonderful for me. It's so full circle to come back and work with educators from the school now in my consulting capacity. And this amazing educator, Susan Sisak, was saying to me last year, she said, I have this unit and it's all about being a change maker. And she said, up until now, what we've been doing is kind of looking at and researching historic people, how they've made a change, what that looks like. But it was fairly much research driven in an academic sense. And the students did a fairly traditional summative assessment at the end that got shared within the walls of the classroom, right? So this is a very common model. We see this with lots of different units that teachers may teach. And I said, okay, so how might we think about bringing community engagement or services action into this picture? What might this look like? And so she and I worked through a design cycle on this, and we looked at all kinds of different ways that she might add layers of service learning and active global citizenship into her unit. And she transformed so many aspects of everyday teaching and learning so that the students were interacting with so many different members of the community throughout the unit. They invited into the classroom different community partners that were service community partners with the school in a variety of capacities, artists from the community, some of the high schoolers who were doing some really interesting work with community partners. And the students, instead of doing research just from typical media sources, started to do research that was real in terms of interviewing these people in their community and getting to know about what they were doing and how they were making a change. They were also doing a lot of deep reflection throughout because they were taking what they were learning from the interviews and also applying it to their own journey and their, sense of themselves as a person and what their interest, skills, and talents were. And so we were quite deliberate and purposeful about building that in. And instead of their old summative assessment, which was again quite static and traditional, what happened was that they were able to display their learning in a changemaker fair. And the students were able to, again, consolidate everything that they had learned about community and how people were making a difference in communities. And it was so apt because it was so relevant. It's right there in the ISK community. And then put that together in a way that they could present that out to other community members and parents, et cetera. And they really became advocates for what it means to be a change seeker and a change maker. And what Susan was so impressed with is that her ELL students, she said, a lot of them, they're quite shy, right? Like they're learning a new language, they're communicating and feeling sometimes self-conscious about that, but keen, they want to grow their skills. And she said to watch them at the Changemaker Fair when they were conveying their final experiences to the rest of the community was for her like just the icing on the cake because of everything that it showed in terms of the impact that this experience had had on the students. And so she is going on now this year to revamp a whole lot of other units in her curriculum because what she realized out of this was, okay, I didn't have to throw my whole unit out. I just had to take my existing unit, keep what I love, tweak some aspects of everyday teaching and learning and assessment. And all of a sudden now I have a unit that is just knocking it out of the park in terms of student engagement and learning and impact in the community. So that's a quick example that comes to mind as a recent one and a really wonderful success story.
But this sounds so impactful, and it's helpful to hear it as a story. You know what I heard that really just got my juices flowing was Changemaker Fair. I'm not familiar with that, but I love that idea. And of course, applying the design cycle, I taught design as a sub for a year in Rome, and that really got me thinking about that whole iterative process. And, it's really, especially if you had someone to bounce ideas off, not that hard to take a unit and revamp it with this lens and look at ways that you can make it more about change making and including the community and so on. And that's just so wonderful to hear. Thank you for that very rich story and experience. Let's move on to our second concept, global citizenship. So tell us about the forms it can take and how it can impact student learning.
I love that. Many people, again, will use these terms quite interchangeably. And I think it's really good for school communities to figure out what language works for them. We have big conversations about this in the service learning global citizenship realm because some people feel quite strongly about the term service, and some people either feel very positively strong about that word or negatively strong about that word. And so that word can hold some baggage for people. And I always say, look, it doesn't matter if you call it service learning or active global citizenship or community engagement. And the IB, of course, is just changing all of that language, to lean to community engagement now. Services action as well. People will use that phrase quite a bit. Any of those words or terms can work well if they suit your context and if they make sense for your community. And so settle on the term that, sits well with your stakeholders. And then as long as everyone is using that common language and you understand what it means and you're committed to doing it well, then it's going to be good for you, So if we're talking about service learning, active global citizenship, there are ways of doing these things so well in such an exemplary way with critical mindsets, avoiding saviorism, avoiding tokenism, avoiding all of the things that we want to avoid at all costs, in this work. And then there are ways of doing these things in harmful capacities. And so I think no matter what you call it, it's about that stance of like, how are we doing this? And so typically with global citizenship, one thing that might be a little bit different in terms of how people use the term or bring it to bear on their practice could be that there's a little bit more intentionality around things like global competencies and that sense of being aware of, what are the articulated global competencies that exist either as defined by organizations like the OECD and organizations like that maybe have more of a global north kind of perspective, or, other perspectives like indigenous wisdom and knowledge and what that might look like there in terms of competencies too. And so that carries a little bit more of that aspect to it. And sometimes when we think about citizenship, I think it too carries with it just connotations that imply, right, an engagement with different levels of knowledge and understanding and action that perhaps service learning doesn't carry. Although I think, again, if you're doing service learning well, this is going to very much look the same. It's just perhaps going to have a bit of a different name. And so those are kind of conversations that happen a lot, especially with people who are in this area. In fact, I am heading up the ASA, the Association of International Schools in Africa, their service learning program. And we have a service learning design team. And I work with 8 incredible educators from around the region who are super passionate and committed to service learning. And we've been having these conversations because we're saying, is it time for us to think about the terms that we use in the region? Because some of our constituents do actually have a little bit of baggage associated with the service word. And so we've been having design sessions around that. And it's really, really a great experience to try and think, how do we capture everything that is service learning? Because we're really talking about transformative teaching and learning that embodies all of these things that, we've already been talking about, and things like digital citizenship and storytelling and all of these things all rolled into one. And so it's actually quite difficult to find a term that captures it well because it is just so cohesive. And so, yes, in terms of many different contexts, global citizenship will look a lot like service learning.
Well, I think part of that is being sure to be transparent about what you mean and making sure, like you said, that the local constituents, the local stakeholders have a say in what it's called and what it looks like. But I hear your point very much about the whole loaded term of the word service.
Yeah. And, it really can be so loaded in a positive way, too. I had a great conversation recently with another educator, and this is her word. She's like, when I think about community engagement or active global citizenship, she's like, I support all of that so much. But she said, then I think we lose something with those terms because there is that sense, and the neuroscience certainly supports this in terms of what does it mean to really take on a mindset of altruism where you're really thinking about how do I have compassion and empathy and generosity and kindness driving my own sense of self and my understanding of my place in the world and in my community. And that isn't necessarily as embodied in some of the other language. And so that's a very, very good point too. And so again, all of these conversations I think are super rich because they help us to define what is it exactly that we are hoping to do and achieve with this type of approach to teaching and learning.
What I'm hearing, and Audrey, I bet you'll agree, is so much about the definition and interpretation and sometimes complexity. And what is your experience? It reminds me of Dr. Derek Gay. When we interviewed him, he said, let's start with definitions when we get into DIJ and belonging. And that, I think, was very helpful. And I'm sure for our audience, just unpacking these terms in a non-judgmental way is huge. And back to just building understanding and where people are coming from. So I think that's so valuable. Well, why don't we do the same thing as we did previously? Could you share a story of how this might look in a classroom when you've worked with a teacher?
I would love to share. And there are so many examples. So if it's okay with you, may I share an example from my own practice? Because immediately I was thinking about this incredible experience that happened at Concordia International School, Shanghai. I was teaching a class called Global Development Studies. And you can tell by the name of that class that it was very geared to active global citizenship and service learning. And it was very much an applied learning class. And the students spent the first semester learning all about global issues, sustainable development, principles of sustainability. And then in the second semester, they put together proposals to actually do a semester-long project and experience where they would apply what they had learned, either in the school community or in the local community. This one group of students decided that they really wanted to investigate and act in relation to food waste at the school. And what was so incredible about this experience was the deep engagement that the students had as they started to go down the rabbit hole of investigating how to find out, first of all, how much food waste we were producing, because that had never been sorted before. And no one knew, we didn't know how much food waste we were producing. Nobody had ever weighed it or measured it in any way, shape, or form. So they had to develop the systems and processes for that, working with the operations team. And once they got that worked out, they had to spend a couple of weeks every day weighing the food waste and, taking care of the data and all of that, and then analyzing it. What they found was very interesting and surprising because the school was producing much more food waste than anyone had ever imagined. And this only came to light because of the research that the students were doing. And a lot of times when we think about service learning and active global citizenship, one thing that comes to people's minds is more of a direct model of service, right? Maybe my students are going to be working with a community partner or going on site somewhere and, doing something that might kind of look a little bit more like community service, right? Or something like that. But in actual fact, advocacy and research are two forms of action that are so incredibly powerful with this pedagogical approach. And so in this particular instance, this research was used to create such positive change because the school leadership, once they became aware that this was the case, said, oh my goodness, this is completely unacceptable. And the students were like, this is completely unacceptable. And from that came then further action that the students could engage in because they actually worked with the school leaders to say, okay, how are we going to fix it? And now the school had a certain role to play in figuring out what that was going to look like in the kitchen with the food service provider. And the students had a role to play in terms of figuring out how to help their peers understand the problem and not contribute to it with the food that they were throwing away at the end of lunch. And by the end of this process, that particular year, the food waste went from an astounding 300 kilograms a day, which is a lot, right? It was so much, down to about 100 kilograms a day. And from there, they had an additional plan that another group of students were going to pick up to work with local farmers and take the rest of that food waste and partner with local farmers and get it to farms to be created into compost. Now, that actually got interrupted with COVID. and has not been resumed at this point in time. But it was brilliant to see that they had gone from this massive problem to completely solving the problem within about a 6-month time period. And it was completely student driven. And so it's a wonderful example of how research and advocacy can create very concrete, beautiful change. And those kids have gone on, they're all, into university now and actually graduating, many of them this year. But they have gone on to be incredible change makers in their college situations as well, because I think they felt through this experience, they could see, wait a minute, like we can actually create this kind of change. It's possible.
That's so beautiful. And I love the way it brings research and the idea that, like you say, they can have a voice. It brings all of that to light for them and really drives home that message, and that they continued on with that into university. That's exactly what we want out of these international schools, is to help them see that. And not just tell them, but help them actually live it. That's so amazing. What a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that. So you've really alluded to this already, but maybe we can go into a little more detail about the term community partnership, and how might a school start to set these up and maybe even expand globally?
That is such an important question, because the way that a school can develop partnerships over the long haul in a sustainable fashion can have such a bearing on the success of an overall service learning, active global citizenship, community engagement program. And so, one thing I encourage schools to do initially is to kind of do an inventory and to think, okay, what organizations are we already working with? What organizations already have a history with our school? And in what capacity have they had that history? What does this look like? And so start to kind of actually map that out, because in a lot of schools, this happens very kind of organically and kind of a little bit off the cuff. And sometimes it's not necessarily so intentional. And so how can we work with our partners to say who is already connected? Now, how can we work with those partners that are already connected to say, how can we get to know each other better? How can we actually work together in a way where our students are learning from and with you, so we're not just involved in, let's say, fundraising or direct action that doesn't allow our students to actually get their boots on the ground with you, and learn more about what you're doing in a really authentic way. And once that starts to happen and you start to see that partner getting plugged in different areas of the school. So maybe they do something with a class in elementary, a class in the middle school, a class in high school. Maybe they're working, with some co-curricular groups. Then the next step is to say, okay, where in the curriculum do we have entry points where it would really be rich to work with a community partner so that the students can actually apply their knowledge and skills? What kind of community partners do we need for those entry points? What does that look like? And then to actually go and seek community partners that will really fill those gaps in a way that will be rich for student learning, and also that will meet the needs of that community partner as well, so that it's very reciprocal. The key is that open dialogue and deep listening. I am a big fan of deep listening. I use a story circle protocol in so many contexts with community partners, in school situations, in so many different ways, because that ability to listen and connect across difference is really important with our community partners. And so again, rather than kind of taking a surface approach with community partnerships where it's like, I don't know, this parent knows this organization, we're going to kind of do a book drive or a fundraising campaign, but nobody really kind of connects. It's like, actually, we're only going to work with community partners where we can sit at a table together or in another context, get to know each other and really see that we are connected in important ways with them, and that we are both meeting some needs by being in relationship. And when that can happen, then magic occurs, right? And students can be so impacted by their work with community partners. And so that's a really good kind of starting point, is to do an audit and then build out from there.
I would love to hear a story of an effective community partnership that you were involved in. Do you have one?
I have so many stories of community partners. Oh gosh, again, hard to know where to start, but actually I would love to start with one where it might demonstrate what this looks like as a work in progress, if that's okay. And so I'm working with an incredible school right now in Ghana, Al Rayyan International School. It is such a special school. Their head of school, Fatma, is just the most passionate, compassionate person on the planet, I think. And her whole team has just been permeated with her spirit. And so there's just an amazing sense of community at Al Rayyan International School. And they've been really working on developing further their service learning program in a formal and purposeful way. And they're at the stage right now where they have done the audit and they've looked at what community partners they have. And now they're thinking about, how do we invite those community partners into a deeper relationship with us? And so they are actually planning some deep listening story circles for February, where they're going to be inviting community partners along with parents and other stakeholders for the community, alongside students of all ages and teachers, to participate in some deep listening circles where people can really connect and get to know one another better, but then use those conversations to ideate, okay, what does this look like as we begin to drive this work into truly reciprocal territory, which is amazing. So that I'm really excited about. And I think for anybody listening who's at a school where this is maybe at a starting point, this can be an inspiring way of thinking like, oh, okay, here's some steps in terms of how we might be able to move forward. I also just had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with an amazing team of teachers from the American International School of Lusaka. And I was down in Lusaka in the fall and worked with some of these teachers through some PD sessions that we were running. And two grade 4 teachers who are really passionate about service learning had a unit that's called Sharing the Planet that happened in the fall, late in the fall. And they specifically worked with some community partners. And I have a link actually to an interview with them that I can share if you would like to include it in the show notes to illustrate. They pulled all of these community partners together and they said, okay, we want our students, again, not to just do research through traditional media means. We want them to talk to real people. And they really helped the students develop their interview skills and their interpersonal skills. And in the interview, you'll hear the students say that at first, when they had these wildlife experts coming into their classroom, that it felt a little bit scary, because these were like strangers they didn't know and they had to get brave and ask some questions. But then they said the more they did it, the more comfortable they got and how excited they were to learn from these incredible experts in the field. And what was amazing was not only did they involve the partners in the research, but at the end of the unit, the students had produced digital stories about what they had learned about the animals and how they thought that, everyone could contribute to helping with animal conservation in Zambia. They invited those community partners to come to a final summative fair where, again, the students were sharing their digital stories and the community partners were invited to set up tables and help to, again, advocate for what they were doing with the rest of the school and parent community. And to hear these community partners reflect on what this meant to them, because they've been connected with the school for quite some time. And so this added such an additional layer of depth to their partnership. And one of the incredible outcomes of this work with the partners was that after the fair, when all of the students were presenting and sharing and the partners were interacting, they had the partners stay behind and they had a lunch for them. And what they were commenting on was how incredibly powerful it was for them to network with each other because they didn't all know each other before. And the school brought them together and they were all working on aspects of conservation in Zambia in these different ways. And then through their collaboration and networking with this event, all kinds of new things are happening because now they have these relationships together. And I'm like, oh my goodness, there are so many ripples of goodness coming out of this unit. But really, it was the one teacher who's very connected with some of these groups because of her work with an after-school club that really is all about conservation. She was really the visionary behind this. And she brought those partners in and said, we're going to take this deeper because of what we're doing in the curriculum. So that's another really great story and example.
It totally gives me the warm fuzzies to hear that. I love it.
So let's build on what you're saying. I really appreciate the deep listening, the active listening. And as Audrey was pointing out, we want our kids to be change makers. It's probably part of our mission statements, but really, how do you do it? And so what I'm hearing here is consistently the how to. So let's get at the question of how can schools think deeply in approaching these partnerships as we foster global citizenship. And the part you were hitting on there, the understanding in our students. And as a positive psychology person, I think of a lot of character strengths what an opportunity to bring them in, like social intelligence, fairness, kindness, leadership. So the students, if the schools have a wellness program based on positive psychology, they know their character strengths and they know which ones they want to work on. So I see a real connection there. So let's do this as a two-parter. First, how to help think deeply, more how-tos, but then let's look at some potential struggles that can negatively impact the efforts, as well as some thoughtful strategy to help guide our efforts. So it's kind of a three-parter. Let's see what you've got on this one. It's a kind of a biggie.
I love this. And I'm so glad, David, that you're bringing wellness and well-being into this conversation because in my experience, service learning and active global citizenship is so deeply connected to what our schools are doing with wellness and well-being. And I am a big fan of helping schools think about all of these initiatives in a cohesive way. So I think that it can be very overwhelming for teachers when we silo these things, right? And when we say, okay, we've got a big initiative with well-being, we've got a big initiative with DEI, we've got a big initiative here with service learning, whatever it might be. And teachers are busy and they've got a lot on their plates, and it becomes very challenging to think like, I've got to tick all the boxes in these areas, when in actual fact, there is so much intersectionality between these things. And so how do we actually make it easier for educators and students to say, this is about the way we're approaching our teaching and learning in a transformative fashion. And in order to do that in a way that is relevant and interdisciplinary and meaningful, we are going to be thinking about mindsets and student learner outcomes and well-being, because that's all part of how we want to think and be as we understand our curriculum in this space of the complex world that we live in. And so I'm really glad you brought that up. That was a total aside, but I'm really grateful for that entry point. And I think that in terms of helping schools think deeply about this, one thing that I go back to time and again with schools is that mission and vision foundation, because again, we can have these words, right? But are they laminated or are they lived, right? And if they're laminated, then okay, fine, but that's not really going to impact anything at all, right? In terms of how we're doing school. If they're lived, then oh my gosh, they have to touch everything, right? And if they do, then how incredible is that going to be when we actually are strategic about what that looks like pre-K through 12? And so once a leadership team can be committed to that kind of approach to what they're doing in their school, then I think it becomes very easy to say, yes, and now we need to have a very clear strategic plan over 3 to 5 years for what this looks like and how we're building these experiences for students. And again, what that looks like in terms of their understanding of who they are in relation to their local and global communities. Community partnerships becomes a natural part of that. So then those approaches are not going to be shallow and they're not going to be kind of one-off or tick box kind of things, because if the intention is authentic and real, and everyone is on board with that, then the way that is lived out becomes intentional and authentic and real as well. So to me, that's the real key, is to change the mindset of like, this is an extra thing that we're adding on, and to say, no, not at all. In fact, if you go down that road, you're probably going to end up in a whole bunch of red zone areas where you don't want to be. But rather, no, this is foundational. And this is about who we are as a school community. And we want to live it, right? We want to see it when each of those graduates crosses that stage, getting their grade 12 diploma. We want to be able to look at each one and say, wow, that is how they, as a unique human being, are living this out. And isn't that amazing, right? So that's what comes to mind as the most important starting point for doing the work in a deeper way.
What's great about that is nearly every school I've been at, and there have been a few, has I knew I was going to make that mistake, has global citizenship literally or implied in their mission. And so the fact that you're facilitating getting that to be lived and not laminated is fantastic. It just makes so much sense. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Audrey, I'm so glad you said digital as a slip there, because I am a huge digital storyteller, and I'm a big fan of digital storytelling, particularly as a way for students to act when they want to be advocates, right? And to engage in some really amazing dialogue about important local and global issues. So I think the whole digital citizenship thing is very rolled up in everything that we're talking about too.
Phew, saved by the bell.
So much commonality.
Yes.
In terms of some common challenges that schools experience, in my experience working with schools, in terms of implementing service learning throughout the curriculum, usually come down to a couple of things. And I think it's all rooted actually in essential understandings. And so, we've talked about the importance of being super grounded in mission and vision, and then really understanding, okay, what does this look like in a foundational way to take it seriously and try to weave it into the curriculum in all ways. I think that probably the biggest challenge would be if key stakeholders don't really kind of grasp that idea or have kind of just a partial understanding of what service learning or active global citizenship can look like, then the challenge becomes kind of coming at it maybe without as much commitment as might be required. And so, you might grow some shallow roots, but if you're not kind of deliberate about making this culture wide and really growing the deep roots, we all know, because we've been part of international school communities, you have people move in and out of our communities. You know what I mean? You might have a service learning champion, but they move on to another school. And then if the roots aren't deep, well, the plant withers, right? And so I think one of the biggest challenges is that, because the sustainability of growing these initiatives and maintaining them, it's hard, right? Just given that dynamic. And so that's where I think that the systems change is really key, because if we can get systems in place where everyone understands what this looks like and how this is deeply embedded in the DNA of the school, then that becomes something you don't have to worry about so much, because people are going to be hired with that in mind, and they're going to be, very quickly learning about what that looks like in that particular school context. So if the roots are shallow, that's, I think, the biggest challenge. Some strategies for that are, of course, the strategic planning, the deep understanding, and also the storytelling. So back to that, if we're not sharing the stories of what happens in our classrooms and the impacts that are occurring because of what we're doing with this applied learning strategy, then again, we're missing an opportunity to grow the culture. So I like to cycle, and I'm sure you both have ridden bikes before, and you know what happens, right? If you're on your bike and you look to the left, your bike goes to the left. Where we look is where we go, right? And so I always say with this, it's the same with storytelling. If we put these stories out into the community regularly and with intention, and this becomes, again, part of us revealing what our DNA is, well, then that's going to help us look in that direction more and more. And our conversations will be more and more about that. And we'll see the incredible impact on the learners and on the community. And then it takes on a life of its own, like that becomes something that it's too precious for us to kind of just push into a closet or forget about. And so those are some strategies that can help with that sustainability piece.
And that leads really nicely into our next question, which is asking you to share maybe some approaches to integrating service learning and global citizenship into the curriculum. And you did tell some stories, but maybe you can share some of the strategies and some of the benefits for students.
I would love to do that. There are some really simple ways where we can look for entry points for service learning and active global citizenship in our curriculum. So, as teachers, we are in touch with what's happening in the world. We care about current events. That can become an interesting and rich way of having some entry points for service learning, because as our students look at the curriculum and then they look at current events that are connected to the curriculum, it becomes quite natural for them to want to investigate and research further, and then look for various assets and needs that might be associated with that, where they can actually take action. So looking at current events in connection to curriculum is a very easy entry point. Another way is thinking about literature and the different literature that you might have already in your units. So if you're an English or a social studies teacher, you will always have a lot of different texts that you're working with. Some of these texts are very, very well suited for students to do research and learn more about local and global implications and then take action as a result of what they're learning. If you teach science or math, there are still going to be things that your students are researching and learning where there will be core texts or core videos or core sources that they're identifying. How do those connect in any way, shape, or form to your local or global context? And then what do you want to do with that in terms of helping students apply their learning? Another way is to think about your students and who they are as people. We're all passionate about different things. We all have different interests, skills, and talents. And these are great ways of starting to think about asking students to apply what they're learning in very specific ways in your classroom. So, if you have someone who loves making movies, then as a summative assessment, instead of perhaps doing a presentation in class, wouldn't it be amazing for that student to be able to make a movie and then share it even beyond your classroom walls, maybe even to a global audience? If you have a student who really loves to crochet, well, how incredible might it be as a summative assessment for that student to actually apply their knowledge and skills? Let's say you're in a unit learning about refugees. Can they actually lead, a yarn arts experience where people crochet and knit and donate, those in some meaningful way? Of course, it would all have to be like very much research to know that this is a need that is being met in an authentic way, but that kind of thing. So starting with your students and who they are as people and what they love to do can also be a really great starting point for looking for those entry points. And I love starting with standards and benchmarks. I know it sounds nerdy, but I am a complete curriculum nerd. And I think it's great to start with your standards and benchmarks and say, okay, here's my standards and benchmarks for this unit. Where do I personally see entry points for where this might connect to action and community engagement? And I have never seen a unit yet where there isn't some connection to something that is right there in the school community or the local community. And I suppose if you did find a unit where there was absolutely zero connection, my question would be, why are you teaching that? Like, I don't understand how that connects in any way, shape, or form to something tangible and real. But I have never seen a unit like that. When you look at those standards and benchmarks, you are always able to find an application. And so that's a great way to start too.
Even in math?
Even in math.
Wow.
I'm smiling here. Audrey and I were both instructional technologists. So we were coaches and we used the TPAC model to integrate technology. And what you just shared was the conversation I had repeatedly with teachers, often that it wasn't about technology. It was about differentiation and individualization. And the whole idea of doing assessments around what are the interests and the strengths of the students and really what do they want to do. So much of what you're talking about to me, they come out of the normal teacher toolkit. Like, this is project-based learning perfectly. And it's problem-based learning if you're working on a service learning opportunity that there's some struggles in the community and the kids need to figure out a way to solve that problem. You've repeatedly talked about inquiry and research. So these are tools that we know about. And then my favorite, and this dates me, digital storytelling. I remember when I started as an instructional technologist in grad school in 1999, there was this article in Multimedia Magazine about this approach called digital storytelling. And I wish I knew the name of the author because it was way ahead of the time. So it's wonderful to hear that these aren't new things. These instructional strategies are right there. Teachers use them already. And just like you've been saying, the theme of all this is we're not inventing new things. This is all part of the normal instructional approach that schools have. We're not siloed. We're just going to leverage them and show commonality between the service learning and the growing our students with our global awareness. So I say this is wonderful and it makes so much sense. You were using the term the design cycle. So I'm now thinking of personnel for these teachers. One of the big steps of putting these plans together, you're saying, is to communicate what they're about and how there is the intersectionality, as you're saying. And then one of the other components would be, well, how am I going to do this? Who's going to help me? So I'm guessing, like you have in Africa, for example, your design team for the whole continent. But within schools, what is the personnel situation to help support this? So I'm guessing coaches, for example. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yes. It can look different in different schools depending on who is hired for which positions and what those positions look like. But coaches are a fantastic resource in this regard. So if curriculum coaches have experience with this way of teaching and learning, and most curriculum coaches are going to be very familiar with the inquiry cycle and concept-based inquiry and different approaches like that, and the design cycle. And service learning isn't separate from those things. It is very much one and the same. So typically we might think of service learning as having 5 stages, where we start with investigation, then we've got our planning portion of what we do to take action, then actually taking action, reflecting throughout, and then demonstrating your learning at the end. These 5 stages are absolutely congruent with the inquiry cycle. And so it's a matter of then like thinking about, how are my teachers who I'm coaching, how are they using the inquiry cycle? What does that look like? Now, how might I just help them to think about, again, layering in this idea of action and global citizenship, community engagement, service learning as a way of driving the unit. So that becomes a really easy thing for coaches to do. A lot of schools will have perhaps someone in the role of, let's say, a service learning coordinator or a community engagement coordinator. Those people can be key allies and resources in this work. And there's a lot of online resources and availability as well. So, people like me, there's a handful of us that do this work all over the world, and we all have online courses and online coaching options and different things like that. And it is amazing how even in 1 hour, when you are thinking about redesigning a unit, how you can use very simple protocols in 1 hour to take a unit and redesign it with this filter, with this lens. So yeah, I would say that if somebody has resources within a school, like you've got people that you can go to for help with this, that's amazing. And if you feel like you don't have someone on campus who can help you, then reach out, because there's going to be lots of people online who can support your work as well.
So let's move a little bit higher, maybe 10,000 feet. You've been very clear on the integration into the curriculum, and you have spoken about how do we bring service learning and global citizenship into the culture of one school. You've talked about building systems and using storytelling as a way just to grow awareness. Are there any other approaches that you would like to share for bring it into the whole school culture, not just into the individual classroom?
Yes. I have so many other things that come to mind, David. So thank you. And I'm going to see how many of them I can remember as my mind pings back and forth here. Another thing, you were mentioning all of those fantastic ways of teaching and ways of thinking about teaching and learning. And universal design for learning is another one that comes to mind, because when you said differentiation, I was like, oh my goodness, yes. I mean, when you take a summative assessment and you remake it from a more traditional assessment into a more differentiated assessment, let's say using digital storytelling, you are applying principles of universal design for learning for all students. And that just leads to so much more engagement and deep learning and authentic assessment, right? Which is so fantastic. And also in this age, one thing I'm really happy about, I'm a big fan, by the way, of generative AI tools. And I think that there's so many ways that we can be using those with our students and just creating such positive impact. And one thing I think that is really amazing about AI right now is that it is kind of forcing our hand in so many ways with assessment. And this is so good because we have known for a long time that a lot of our assessment practices are not the best for learners, right? But we've kind of continued to do some business as usual because of a lot of reasons. And there are too many to go into on this podcast alone. But I think that now we are being asked to say, wait a minute, if I'm running a traditional assessment and it's easily, cheatable because of new AI tools, well, maybe it hasn't ever been a very good assessment, right? So like, how now can that assessment be much more authentic and organic, involve project-based learning, be process-driven, involve real people from the community, and lead our students to an outcome that is very valuable and meaningful to them? So the fact that I think we're kind of being maybe forced into that way of thinking about assessment, I think is actually really awesome and positive. And so I get really excited about all of that, which is great. So UDL was another thing that came to my mind as you were talking. And I also think about all of the conversations that I have been listening to and hearing and reading about over this last year about transforming education and the deep need for systems change. And so right now I'm doing this incredible program with Thoughtbox Education. I'm a fellow in their program that they have for triple well-being. And it's been such an amazing professional learning experience for me this year. And Thoughtbox has this framework for education that is triple well-being, where it's care for self, others, and planet. And again, thinking about those like a tripod, and like a tripod, if one is weak, the whole thing falls over. So how do we really think about caring for self, others, and planet in all that we do in our schools? And through that fellowship and through lots of other books like Zoe Weil's book, The World Becomes What We Teach, through the Future Learning Design podcast, there's so many conversations where people are saying the time is ripe for us right now to really be asking, how might we make our educational experiences more relevant and meaningful for our students in this complex world that they live in, and the more complex world that is coming at them? And actually, in this week's episode for the Future Design Learning podcast, there were two incredible authors. Oh, goodness. My memory is I'm not going to be able to pull their names up right now, but they've just done this incredible book about disengaged teens and how the research, the data is showing that teenagers en masse are feeling very disengaged from school because they just can't see the relevance between what they're learning in school and what's happening in the world. And so I think, like at a very 10,000 foot level, this is perhaps why I'm so passionate about service learning and active global citizenship. Because again, if we just ask the question, why does this matter? We can cut away a lot of the garbage and the noise, right? And get right to the heart of like, this unit is about X, and we're engaged in this unit because ... What is the answer to that question? And so I think, again, like from a 10,000 foot level, to me, all of these conversations about transforming education align with this work. And so, yeah, I think it's an exciting time for all of that. I've kind of meandered there a bit in my answer, David, but I got really excited.
Well, what I'm hearing is back to your deep listening, bringing people together. And we talk about from time to time disruption as a way to bring about good things. We often think of disruption. And I know the Harvard professor Christensen, I think, who did a lot of work on this. And it, like COVID, it led to a lot of betterment in many cases of how we do online learning, for example. And UDL, which has been around a long, long time for neurodivergent students, I used to have other podcasts and we used to talk about it. That's an oldie but goodie, but boy, I'm seeing a lot of discussion online, people looking at that. And as you said, it's a natural lens to look at differentiation. So maybe here's a thought, because one of the themes that's come up is working with our boards, the board of directors at schools. And back to your building understanding is probably the first step. So have you had some interactions or heard about how schools are working with their boards, looking at these mission statements, and as you say, to make them real and not just something you're going to laminate and put on the wall? Is that an area to bring about change when it comes to the whole culture of the school?
Yes, it really is. And I think that the boards in many international schools tend to be made up of really caring parents who have a variety of professional backgrounds, right? And so they come to the board because they want to support the school and they want to support positive growth and change in the school. But of course, not all of the people sitting on the boards are educators. In fact, most of them are not, right? And so even though they obviously were a student themselves and they went through the school system, et cetera, I think education is one of those weird places where people can assume they know what it's about because they experienced it. But of course, we know being a student is very different from being an educator. And so I really do believe that bringing the boards on board with this work is pretty key. And again, if a leadership team is really invested in this work, I think that becomes a natural part of how they help to grow the deep roots in their school. So, boards will typically have retreats each year. They're looking at things that are important in strategic ways with the school. And so if service learning becomes an important strategic initiative, inevitably it becomes part of those conversations. And actually, when I was at Schutzamerican School last year, I had the great privilege of being able to make a presentation presentation to their board about service learning because they had a lot of questions. They were really curious. They wanted to know more. And so that was really fun because I got to just, share some things with them. And then they had a lot of questions for me. And it was really a learning session. And that was excellent because they approached it in that way. They were very much like, we're approaching this as people who want to know more, and we are not the experts in the room on this, and we would like to know more. And that was just a wonderful conversation. So I would encourage school board members to think about that. If there's something like this, service learning, or another initiative you think is important for your school and you want to know more about it, invite somebody in either virtually or on site to be a sounding board, to have a conversation, to learn. That's an excellent idea.
And the board, of course, can be a great entry point for the business community because that's where a lot of them also spend part of their time. So I love that tie-in. That's a great question, David.
Also, the board, because of that, there are many connections that can then occur as well in terms of service and service partnerships, because a lot of those organizations, there are so many ways that students might be able to partner up and do incredible research or take action. So that becomes also a really nice jumping off point for perhaps some of those community partnerships and where some of those gaps could be filled.
Well, exactly. And I'm also thinking that there's sure to be a lot of great PR for the school when you do engage in these activities. So there's kind of a carrot for boards and schools looking to toot their horn, I guess, if you will, but it's a side benefit. It's not an intended necessarily main benefit, but it'll be there for sure.
Actually, I interviewed an amazing head of school from Antwerp International School, Andreas Cooni, a couple of years ago about this very thing, Audrey. And I was in a workshop of his at an ECIS conference, and it was a really cool workshop all about like architecture and intention on campuses and culture. It was very cool. And as he was involved in this workshop, he said at one point, storytelling is our marketing. This was about his particular school. And I said to him later, I really want to follow up with you on that because I agree storytelling should be a school's marketing strategy. And so he said exactly that. He said he had really just been thinking about it. And of course, like many places, right, there's a lot of competition for prospective families. And a lot of international schools are in this position, right, where it's like, how do we attract the right families? What does this look like? And he said, okay, so what we did is we basically got rid of all of our marketing. We just stopped. And instead, they hired a storyteller. And this particular person went around the school, and their job was to capture the stories of what was authentically happening in classrooms and beyond, and just share that out. And he said, since they took on that strategy, their marketing was looking after itself because it was so authentic that the families that were coming to them, they had more families coming to them. And the families that were coming to them were like, yeah, no, we're already sold. We already know, right? We already know this is the right place for us. This is totally great. And so he's like, yeah, we didn't have to think anymore about like how to market. We're just telling our story and doing so in a super authentic way. And so, yeah, I fully believe that that is a wonderful side benefit for schools as well.
That's a perfect segue into the whole idea of digital storytelling. So maybe you can give us some more detail about the benefits for students, how it ties into service learning and global citizenship, and how it promotes them, of course, and then the whole idea of wellness into that too. That's a huge question that's probably for a whole other podcast, but how does digital storytelling elevate the level of this work?
I could talk about digital storytelling for hours, so I'm going to condense this down into my most pricey answer of all time. Let's see if I can do it. So, digital storytelling in a nutshell, if anyone's not sure what we mean by that term, is basically the creation of a story in digital form in any kind of way that maintains a narrative. So that could be something like a blog post, a podcast, a video. It could also be something like an infographic or a graphic novel type approach that's done digitally. And so the idea is, does it have a narrative arc? And is there an intention in terms of, is there an audience? Is there an actual intention with this story? And what is the essential call to action after engaging with this story? And so I love digital storytelling for learners of all ages. And so even our youngest learners in pre-kindergarten are very capable digital storytellers. Now, the types of stories they might tell are going to be more simple and more direct, but they are very, very capable digital storytellers. And then, of course, all the way through to grade 12, where we can get very, very intense with what we do sometimes, if that's something we want to do. And so what I love about digital storytelling is you can use digital storytelling to really engage students in everyday teaching and learning. So we all know our students are digital natives. They know the digital world. They know their digital tools. They love working with their digital tools. And a lot of the time we worry perhaps about how much time they might be spending on screens. And so a lot of that screen time, if it's just mindless consumption, that is not good. Many people will have read The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. Fantastic book. There's a lot of issues associated with that mindless consumption. How might we help our students use their devices in ways that are generative and creative and innovative and positive? So if we can help them turn their time into content creation instead of just mindless consumption, then how amazing is that in terms of empowering them to know how to use their technologies and their devices in really impactful ways? And so I love that part of digital citizenship and digital storytelling. I also love that this is the way our world operates now, right? In terms of communicating messages and being someone who can be involved in authentic dialogue. We need to know how to navigate those digital spaces. So what does it look like to use your voice in a way that has impact in an online realm or in a digital way? These are really essential skills. And then, of course, if we use digital storytelling in assessment, it captures the UDL component beautifully because students have voice and choice. If you offer them, you can choose any kind of product as long as you're conveying your learning and you're using it, to create advocacy or impact. So we have UDL built in there, and we have such impact beyond the classroom. So again, whereas perhaps a presentation or an essay or a report is just staying in the classroom walls, a digital product can be shared with the school community and well beyond. And so that becomes pretty exciting as well. So I think that in terms of advocacy for service learning, digital storytelling is just a beautiful way to invite students to be agents of change in ways that feel really authentic and also very wide reaching.
Yeah, that's amazing. And they do love making digital stories. And so it's automatically engaging. One thing that you just got me thinking about is to what extent, and maybe you have done this, to what extent do students get involved in the iterative process of looking at a curriculum or a unit and adding in these aspects that you're talking about? Because talk about student voice and choice. And also, as a teacher, it's nice to have, extra ideas coming in. So I'm wondering if you've ever worked with students being part of developing the curriculum in that way.
Yes. In my own practice, towards the end of my time in the classroom, that is where I had moved to, was asking the students to be co-designers with me. And at first, it feels a little scary. It's a new territory, right? Where you're sort of kind of reaching out into this space and thinking, I don't know. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know what we're going to create together. And it can feel a little bit messy, but wonderful. And of course, the kids, they love it because they're not often asked to participate in such a way with agency in their own learning process. And when they are given that opportunity, it just, it empowers them in so many ways. And so I highly recommend that. And again, of course, it's going to look different for younger learners than it will for older learners. And that's okay. Like, what is age appropriate and developmentally appropriate? But wherever possible, I think it's really amazing for teachers to invite students into that design process, be it either of the summative assessment or of the unit itself. Because again, if the students can look at the standards and benchmarks, and I think even young learners are very capable of this, if they look at the standards and benchmarks and they understand what it is they're supposed to know and be able to do at the end of the unit, I think that they have beautiful ideas about what that might look like in terms of their learning journey. And so, yeah, I think sometimes we are a little bit too perhaps married to the curriculum, capital T, capital C, and perhaps a little too married to our own ideas too of what that might look like. And so in what ways could we open up space for students to speak into that? I think if people can experiment with that a little bit, maybe even take a baby step with that, I think that the results can be really beautiful.
I'm going to keep coming in as the instructional technologist and saying to our listeners that it might sound like transformative pedagogy, but so many of these tools that you're talking about, like I just said, digital storytelling's been around for 20 some years, for example. UDL's been around for over 20 years. Project-based learning's been there forever. They're all the normal things in your toolkit. And we've been focusing on one area to use them, but I would say to teachers who've been a little bit reticent about trying some of these different tools to some extent, they're going to work in almost all of your content areas. So folks, keep that in mind. I've been out of the classroom for a long time now, I guess, but I think most teachers are on board with these approaches. And you're not just literate, you become fluent in using these instructional strategies. All right, since I'm talking about teachers and we're kind of getting towards the wrap up section now, let's talk about wellness, because you did say earlier at the start, we really have to be aware of initiative fatigue, that there can be so much going on. The teachers feel overwhelmed. Yet you've really showed how all of this is interconnected, and it's really a part of your mission. And your other point is, if you really are going to fulfill your mission, you've got to get down in these classrooms and design these learning experiences for your students if you're going to fulfill that mission. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways here. So let's look at prioritizing wellness for teachers as they approach bringing service learning and global citizenship into their classrooms.
It is such an important part of this conversation. David, thank you for bringing us back to this. Because again, I think about the thought box paradigm of care for self, others, and planet. And I would probably think you would agree with me here that teachers as a whole are incredible nurturers. We got into teaching because we care about others and we care about kids, and we want to be in a profession where we can make a difference, right? A positive difference. And as a result of that, I think we do a really good job of caring for other people and caring for our students. I think we do a terrible job of caring for ourselves. I know so many teachers who are tired and feel a lot of burdens on a lot of different levels. And so that self-care piece is crucial because, of course, if we are not feeling like we are well, and if our students too, who can be very stressed in our busy international schools, if they are not feeling essentially well, then the work that we can do as change makers is very much diminished or impacted. And I think about, in education, this is perhaps a bit personal as well for me because my youngest daughter is a teacher and she's in her 5th year of teaching. And, at that 5-year mark, I think you're kind of evaluating, do I want to stay in this forever? Is this what I want to do for the rest of my life? And I can see my daughter struggling with this question. And she's an amazing teacher, and we need to keep her in the profession. But what's pulling her away from the profession right now in her heart and mind, I think, is a lot of the systems stuff that grinds you down and impacts your self-care. And so when I think back to what we were talking about in terms of transforming education, I think of her and I think, oh my gosh, if for nothing else than hanging on to our beautiful teachers and not letting them go seek a place where they're going to be able to have more care, not feel so exhausted, not feel so worn down with this, that, and the other thing. So I think, yeah, that's so important. But the self-care piece is key. I think it's key for schools and for leaders to think about what is happening in school environments that is negatively impacting teacher and student self-care, and perhaps do some work there to imagine what that might look like to take some of those factors away. I also think it would be a really amazing thing for leaders to consider, again, transforming culture. What might it be like to put wellness front and center and to think about helping teachers and students to feel very strong emotionally and physically and spiritually so that the learning is deep and so that all of these other things with mission and vision can really be accomplished beautifully. So one thing I love about service learning and all of these approaches we've been talking about is that a big part of wellness is for our students to feel seen, heard, and valued. And teachers want this too, right? And I think often when we are feeling unwell, we do feel unseen and unheard and not valued. And so, in what ways can we as individuals think about how we can take better care of ourselves and help our students do the same? In what way, as school communities, can we begin to investigate what that looks like communally? So, we've got our individual and our collective journeys. And how can some healing happen there so that wellness is not just wellness in words, not the laminated kind, but the lived kind? What does this look like for our schools if people are feeling more well? How do we make that happen? I think that's vital. And students could actually tackle this, talking about service learning. They could investigate, they could research, they could share their findings with school leadership. They could be part of the solutions here. So, how do we make that happen? I think that's a really important and big question.
Feels like we're going to have you back on to dive more deeply into some of these topics because we've covered so many. It's amazing. Are there any other topics that you want to address that we haven't mentioned yet?
Oh, that is a great question. Always so many things to talk about. We haven't even talked about literature and stories at that level in connection to what this looks like. As a former English teacher, I always love to go there. So I think you're right, Audrey. At some point, I would be very delighted to have more conversations with you about so many other things.
It's true. We usually try to keep these to about an hour, and we've gone a little past that. So we'll keep that as a question for another day, dangle that carrot there for people to come back and listen again to our next episode with you if you're willing to come back.
Very willing.
Oh, good. Yay. In the meantime, maybe you can just tell our listeners how they could follow you if they want to learn more about service learning, active global citizenship, community partnership, storytelling, wellness, all the things that you do.
Yes. Well, my website is really easy to find because it's just my name. So it's LeeAnneLavender.com. And my version of LeeAnne has as many letters as you can fit into it. So it's LeeAnne. It's like the longest version of LeeAnne, I think. So LeeAnneLavender.com. I have a blog as well as part of my website. And I try each month to have new stories posted there about what these things look like in school communities. And I have a monthly newsletter that I send out. So if people want to be on my mailing list, they can join through my website. And I try to really jam pack my newsletter with lots of resources and links, things that can make your practice easier and better in terms of all of this work. And so that's one way to connect. And I'm also on LinkedIn. And so you can just search for me, LeeAnne Lavender, on LinkedIn. And that's another great way to connect because always posting and interacting with people there as well.
Thank you. And as we finish up here, I'm sitting here thinking, I want to go back into a school where you're working at that school.
Well, thank you. That's a very kind thing to say. I really appreciate that comment.
Yes. And Audrey and I, as hardworking educators, many years overseas, and as change makers, so much of what you've spoken about today are approaches and systems and empowering people that we tried to do in our schools. And it's pretty wonderful to hear that there are people like you out there helping schools do this because, you know, intentions are big and you want to do the right thing, school leadership, boards, yet it can be overwhelming and not organized very well. We're going to do a show on the whole change process later in the spring. We're bringing on Dr. Jim Reese to help us with that. And one really needs to think this through, put the plans together, get the right people on board, and then all the way into the classroom, as we've said repeatedly, we're not calling on teachers to do things new. It's just, it used to be integrating technology. Now we're talking about integrating global awareness and service learning. And just like you probably are integrating, if you're at a IB school, themes within your curriculum. So this is not new. And you're offering such a clear pathway to do this. So thank you for taking the time. It's been nice talking to two Canadians. And as an American, I love Canadian people. I love Canada, and I want you to stay just the way you are.
Oh, thank you, David. And it's just been a wonderful conversation. I have enjoyed this time so much.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on what David said about how integrated it all is or can be, and that tying back into the whole wellness piece where it's not new initiatives all over again. It's not throwing out, as you said, your entire unit. It's tweaking it so that it can touch on all these things and come to life for kids in amazing ways tie in with the community, tie in with the mission. It's just fantastic. I love what you're doing. I want to know more. Let's stay in touch. And thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.